Welcome back. Today we're joined by Colonel Douglas McGregor, a decorated combat veteran and former advisor to the U.S. Secretary of Defense, to, well, hopefully make some sense of our current war. So, as always, it's good to see you, Colonel.
Yeah, make sense. That's a tall order. We'll do our best to describe, but making sense is difficult in Washington.
Well, one area where we could also see the U.S. and possibly its NATO allies coming in conflict with this new bloc being shaped, that is with Russia and China at the center, is, of course, the Middle East. It appears, I'm not sure if there's a stalemate going on with Iran. It appears that Trump, I guess, wanted an easy victory or a short war, but the Iranians appear to have essentially threatened with a massive retaliation against any attack, which makes it very difficult for asserting any escalation control. That is, decide when the war should start, how it should be fought, when it should end. But how does this affect the wider, I guess, strategic picture here? To what extent would, for example, Russia and China involve themselves, or probably already involved themselves to some extent?
I think we have to understand something. The Mossad, CIA, MI6 triumvirate was successful in persuading President Trump a few weeks ago that Iran was on the verge of falling apart, disintegrating, all based on what they claimed was this concerted effort inside the country to overthrow the government. In reality, the protests that began were quite legitimate. They were not violent, and they weren't aimed at overthrowing anyone. These were large numbers of people who are extremely upset over the state of the Iranian economy, for which we in the United States are mightily responsible. Their currency was being systematically destroyed, and they all are aware of that. And that was the foundation for the protests. They were not necessarily aimed at regime change. Then the Mossad, with support from MI6 and CIA, introduced themselves into the equation. And we don't need to go back over the 40,000 Starlight terminals that were smuggled into the country, and the Mossad agents who were operating within the crowds and providing money as well as weapons to people and urging them to shoot at police and kill members of the government and so forth. All of that was thanks to Russian and Chinese assistance, very, very rapidly suppressed and eliminated, frankly. The 40,000 Starlight terminals were shut down, and the Russians and the Chinese both helped in identifying where they were, and that helped the Iranians to eliminate that threat. But the people that went in to tell Donald Trump that Iran was weak and vulnerable and easy to essentially overthrow are still there. And what they then went back to President Trump and said, well, our attempt to overthrow the government surreptitiously utilizing intelligence forces failed. So his answer was, well, what's the next step? And the question was a legitimate one, and he got an answer. And the answer was provided both by the intelligence as well as by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. We don't have enough firepower. We don't have enough force on hand to affect anything inside Iran. The reason nothing has happened thus far is because we're still waiting for additional assets to show up. There are probably at least two more carrier battle groups on their way to the region. Now, one may be in the Mediterranean. I don't know. Another one will certainly be down in the Indian Ocean. But I also don't know what's going on in the Air Force side of the house. We have to remember that the real power behind the strikes on Iran won't come from the fleet at sea. It will come from the United States Air Force. They will deliver presumably from high altitude, out of range of Iranian air and missile defense capabilities, enormous firepower in the form of glide bombs, precision strike weapons, and so forth. So these talks that have now been convened, I think, are meaningless. I don't think the Iranians are terribly fooled. They're showing up because the Chinese and the Russians said, go to the talks, listen to what they have to say. But they've also made it very clear right up front that Mr. Netanyahu's talking points, which form the basis of President Trump's demand, 2 out of those 3 talking points have been dismissed out of hand. And that is any change or dismantlement or restructuring of the missile arsenal so that Israel need not worry about being within range of Iranian weapons. That's off the table. And the notion that Iran will then stop supporting or working with its allies in the region, that's off the table. So the only thing they're willing to talk about, apparently, is enriched uranium. Now, how far can that reach? I'm not sure it can get very far, because if you start talking about levels of enrichment and storage issues and where it's going to be, you're on the road back to the GCPOA that was there under the Obama administration. So I don't think these talks are serious at all. I think they're buying time. So I wouldn't expect anything to happen for another week, maybe 2 weeks, but certainly not for at least another week or 10 days, because more assets are required. Now that brings us to the next question, which is most important. What's the objective of the probable air and missile campaign, which will start in another week to 10 days? Is it regime change? Is that where are we back to that? Or is there something else? Well, I think that you're still going to have a concerted effort to identify, find, target, and destroy the government, if it can be done. But I think this is about destroying Iran. People need to understand that. This is a ruthless war of destruction that is designed to promote the disintegration of the Iranian nation state. They think they can do this. I don't know. I have my doubts. I mean, this is, after all, a nation of 93 million. The area is the size of Western Europe, but of course the areas of greatest interest are still largely in the north and the central part of the country. They're not down south, which means that the targeting challenge is not as immense as it would be if you went after Western Europe. But it's still a significant challenge. And I think that's where they're headed. They simply want to destroy this nation state, cause it to divide, to fragment. And again, you go back to the intelligence assessments, to the people that have been telling Donald Trump, and who told Biden, by the way, Russia is weak. Russia will be easy to defeat. Russia can't withstand the pressure. We're hearing the same kinds of things now about Iran. Now, Iran is not Russia, and Iran has several very serious vulnerabilities. You're familiar with them. Water is a huge problem. Food for the people that live in the country, they are dependent on external deliveries of food. Can the Russians and the Chinese help with those? Perhaps. But I think that's a real danger. The question is, can they do enough damage to the point where somebody stands up and says, enough, we can't take it anymore? Now, what's the Iranian response to this? Well, the Iranian response is that they have no incentive to exercise any restraint. So if they are attacked, their predisposition, Glenn, is to use everything they have. Now, the issue for us is I don't know how effective that will be. I've always said, and I think others agree with this, the Iranians can handle Israel. But can the Iranians handle Israel and the United States in terms of its military power? That is unclear. Now, enormous amounts of weaponry and munitions and missiles and so forth have been delivered over the last few weeks by the Chinese. The Russians have been on the ground and have been working to help with the integrated air and missile defenses. The Chinese, and I presume the Russians as well, but we know without a doubt the Chinese have done this, have provided satellite imagery, real-time feed to the Iranians. So the Iranians are not in a position that they were the last time where they may not know where things are, that they're going to be surprised. I think they know where everything is, and that includes the ships at sea. Now, if you look at the weapons, I don't know how many of these missiles, I think it's the DF-21 or 23 that the Chinese have produced exclusively for the purpose of targeting ships at sea. We haven't seen them used. We don't know how effective they are. But given Iran's performance during the 12-day war, it turned out that their weaponry was actually very, very accurate and very precise. So I think that in addition to firing whatever they've got at Israel, they will very definitely hit our bases, and they will probably go after our ships at sea. What they can affect, obviously, are massive bombing runs right now. Now, we don't know. Perhaps, depending upon the path our bombers take and the altitude, can they be tracked? Well, stealth is something that is not the miracle that most people think of it as being. Stealth, in terms of the design that's built into aircraft, can delay detection, but it can't make you invisible. So you can delay the detection for some period of time. I don't know what that delay looks like. So what we can't address right now is what happens to B-2s that overfly. Can you use B-52s? The B-2s have to be very effective against the air and missile defenses, as well as the critical targets, before you can use B-52s. B-52s are wonderful delivery systems for massive numbers of bombs, but they are very vulnerable because they're an old aircraft. They're easy to target and shoot down. So we just don't know. There are a lot of questions we can't answer. I don't know what the answers are that are being provided to Donald Trump, but I suspect that he is being the victim of what I would call the rosy scenario. Then the final point is, how long can this last? And I think 10 days to 2 weeks is about it, because at that point, we are actually scraping the bottom of the barrel for missiles. And that's not a minor issue, because you've got to protect your ships at sea. You've got to protect bases at home. How many missiles can you afford to expend before you're at an unacceptably, dangerously low level, especially if the Chinese and the Russians become involved? And I think that's the final question. Everybody says, what do you think the Chinese and Russians are going to do? And the only answer I can give is that neither China nor Russia will allow Iran to be pulverized out of existence. In other words, if it gets to the point where Iran really is on the ropes and could disintegrate, then Russia and China, I think, will act. Now, what will that action consist of? It won't be nuclear, but it could involve a collision at sea very easily, because both China and Russia have plenty of submarines, and we're not very good at tracking modern nuclear-powered submarines in deep water. Now, there's something else that deserves mention, because we don't bring it up very much, but I noted that the Khamenei, the Ayatollah in charge, supreme leader, whatever he is, who actually speaks very rationally when you listen carefully to what he says, has made it clear that this war will not be like the last. This will be a regional war. Now, people are interpreting that to mean, well, that's because the Iranians can target all the bases in the region and may ultimately go after ships at sea. That's part of it, but I don't think we're looking at the region through an objective lens. And I'm talking specifically about Turkey, or Turkey. The Turks are very concerned for the following reasons. First of all, they see no benefit to the destruction of Iran for them. What they expect to happen is, if Iran disintegrates, fails to hold together, that they'll be overwhelmed with tens of thousands, maybe millions of refugees. That's probably also true for Iraq and the other surrounding Arab states. None of those states want to face that. And frankly, many millions of those people will probably be redirected towards Europe. I'd be very surprised if that didn't happen. Turks don't want anything to do with that. Secondly, the Turks are dealing with the Israelis right now in Syria, and to a lesser extent in Lebanon. They know what the Greater Israel Project is all about. The population of Turkey itself is enraged over what has happened in Gaza. The hatred of the Israelis in Turkey is so thick that you could cut it with a knife. In Istanbul, there is an exhibit. We would refer to it almost like the Holocaust Museum, something similar to that. And this exhibit is all about Gaza. Now, I have not seen it, but I have friends and relatives that have been in there to see it. And they've told me that it is absolutely shocking. The images of the murdered children and the starving population and the destruction are overwhelming. Turkish population is streaming through this place in Istanbul, gets coverage all over Turkey. And there is a readiness in Turkey, to be frank, to fight. So if you're sitting in Turkey and it looks like things are so bad in Iran that the place could, in fact, fall apart and disintegrate, do you wait to be next on the menu? Because from the Turkish vantage point, Iran goes down. That leaves only us to oppose Israeli Jewish supremacy in the region. And I don't think the Turks want to be alone on that. Now, given that situation, what would you do as a Turk? Well, you would also talk to the Russians and the Chinese. The Russians have a lot invested in Turkey. They're building a nuclear power station there. They've had their ups and downs with the Turks, but this is an existential question. I think the Russians and the Turks and the Iranian or the Chinese will all work out something at some point, and they will be united in their opposition to the destruction of Iran. Now, the other Arab states in the region are militarily irrelevant. Unfortunately, Egypt is an ambulatory patient. It has plenty of troops. It's got plenty of plenty of tanks and so forth and aircraft, but they seem to be unable to do anything because internally, Egypt simply isn't very stable. Egyptian society is not very cohesive. The government seems to be more concerned about the threat presented to it from its own population right now than it is about the Israelis. That doesn't mean they're not sympathetic to everybody else in the region, especially the Iranians at this point, because Egypt and Iran have had good relations now for several years. But I wouldn't expect any of the Arab states to do anything unless it appears that the three states I just mentioned are actually prepared to intervene in some fashion. In other words, this is a disaster on a regional scale that could ultimately spill over and become almost global. That's the bad news. And I don't think there's an appreciation for that in the White House. I think once again, you're dealing with people who say, just as they did about Russia, it's weak, it's this, it's that. And no one will challenge us. No one will stand up to us. What happened the last time? Did the Chinese or the Russians do anything? The answer is no. But the last time was not an existential question. The last time it ended after 12 days. Now, set all of that aside and consider the following. I don't think President Trump wants this to happen. I really don't. But I don't think he has much choice. I think he is a prisoner of his commitments to others over the last couple of years that ended up putting him in the White House. So I don't think he can back away from this. Let me just make an observation that was passed to me a few hours ago by someone who has spent hours, many, many hours, perhaps hundreds of hours, watching video and speeches by President Putin. We pointed to something I found very interesting. You realize that 2 February is the anniversary of the fall of Stalingrad. Americans pay no attention to this. We know that the Russians or the Soviets at that point sustained at least 1 million casualties defending Stalingrad against the Germans. It was not the end of the war for the Germans by any means, but it was a tremendous setback. But it was an important turning point for the Russians because they had had very little success against the German armed forces to that point. Putin went to the memorial service in Stalingrad. And this man remarked it wasn't so much what he said, which was predictable, but he had never seen Putin so somber. Not just deeply moved by the event, because that's not unusual in Russia, but this man was especially somber, almost downcast in his posture and his look. And he tied this to some discussions that have gone on in Russia between various people that suggest that President Putin may have reached the point now where he's not sure there's much hope for any kind of, I don't want to say reconciliation, but any kind of useful agreement with Washington. I think President Putin has now come to the conclusion that Russia may have to oppose us. And it's not something he wants to do, just as I contend that President Trump doesn't really want to spark this war in the Middle East. But Trump puts on a great face. He's a natural marketer. That's his greatest genius, is marketing. And he speaks and he conveys an impression that is totally divorced, I think, from what's really bothering him. But that's not the case with Putin. This apparently was very, very obvious. So I say that because there are a lot of people in the West who don't understand the Russians and certainly don't understand President Putin. And I would urge everybody to take the time to go look at that memorial service for the 2nd of February and watch him very carefully. Not just the translated statements, but look at him and his posture and how he behaves. He's very, very somber. I think he's very serious. And I would take note of that if I were in Washington. And now you mentioned the Europeans. I listened to Donald Tusk this morning. I don't know when he said it, if it was today or yesterday, but tried to make the claim that there was some sort of connection between Putin and Epstein, which is absolutely absurd. There's no evidence for that at all. Putin is not in need of any tax advice from Mr. Epstein, who appears to be, or appeared to have been, in the business of telling people how they could avoid paying taxes. He also didn't need any of Mr. Epstein's other famous services. But I think that tells you something about the Europeans right now. Tusk is a globalist. Macron's a globalist. Starmer's a globalist. Merz is a globalist. All these people are BlackRock affiliates and associated with all the people that, frankly, I would avoid at all costs if I can in the United States. These are people whose morals and belief systems are absolutely anathema to me, and I think most American citizens. But the fact that they were going out of their way, especially Tusk, to try and make a link with Epstein strikes me as being an act of desperation. To try and convince people not just that the Russians are coming, and the Russians are not coming, and that's becoming increasingly obvious to people in Europe. It's also to try and defame once again President Putin and his government as evil incarnate, which it isn't and never was. So I think the Europeans are stuck. And what we're all hoping for is that the respective electorates will throw these people out sooner rather than later, because there's no reason for the conflict between Europe and Russia. But that's something that hasn't happened. And we hope that it does sooner rather than later. I guess the place, according to David Betts, that's most likely to burst at the seams first, and now turns out to be Great Britain. So perhaps that's where it begins. France won't be far behind. And I don't think the Germans will do much until they see it happen elsewhere.
So a crisis of political legitimacy, at least. This is what we appear to have brewing in Europe as well. So, well, before we wrap up, do you have any other predictions in terms of, or not predictions, but thoughts about where we might be heading off, at least here in Europe, in terms of, especially what the Russians might have planned next?
Well, the Russians are going to do what the Russians are going to do. To be perfectly frank, the Europeans are increasingly irrelevant to that process. And what we don't know is what's being decided in Moscow. But I think based upon the observations of this individual who is a professional Putin watcher, and also what we see happening on the ground in eastern Ukraine with the military, this is going to be ended on Russian terms. And the decision is about to be made when, where, and how that will happen. But what we're going to see in the future is going to be different from what we've seen over the last nearly 4 years. But Russia, remember, when they began this process, their military was far too small and completely ill-equipped and incapable of coping with the crisis. And it took a few months for that to settle in, but by June, July, President Putin met with his leaders and decided, we're going to have to change everything we thought. All of our original assumptions are wrong, and we're going to have to build a new force. They've done that. So I think they're in another situation now where they know they have effectively a dominating position on ground in Europe. And they know that the Europeans have nothing with which to stop them. So the question is, how much further do we go before we finally say enough's enough? And there are lots of Russians that are saying we need to go all the way to the Polish border. But I think the predisposition is to go to the Dnieper River, certainly to seize Odessa, and potentially, although it's not something that Putin wants to do, march straight into Kiev and rid themselves of this government. There are others that can take the reins and run government in the rest of Ukraine. But what people have never understood is that the Russians do not want to govern Western Ukraine. They don't. And they have a long history of experience with the people there. So do the Poles, by the way. The only people that seem to have had any real success governing Western Ukraine for any length of time, believe it or not, were the Austrians. And that's actually viewed by most Ukrainians in the West as having been a relatively positive period in their history. But everybody else doesn't want anything to do it. It's kryptonite. Everyone wants to stay away from it. So it may be that eventually these governments in Europe will fall down, will fall apart and be replaced by people that have a more realistic view of themselves. I'm still surprised that Germany, which is on the path to national suicide, given its passion for deindustrialization, has not already awakened. But these things are coming. What I've learned, I think, over the last few years is everything takes longer than you think it would. That's the best I can do for you.
Yeah, that makes it difficult to time it, but the path is nonetheless, it seems, very clearly charted. So, well, Colonel, as always, thank you so much for your time.
Hey, thank you, Glenn.
大家好，我是主播周玉琴。很多的朋友告诉我们，选择原版的太阳星全效克菲尔益生菌，它添加有羽衣甘蓝，健康再加分。而有睡眠困扰的朋友们，赶快选择蓝色包装这一款晚安加强版，绝对是更有感。每日克菲尔，时刻美好 ，Good Feel Good， 请上快点购为健康下单，而且要记得输入推荐代码，有额外的折扣优惠。太阳星全效克菲尔益生菌基础版、晚安加强版，新包装改版，内容不变，抽取更方便。要吃就吃最好的。